Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 654 for the 21st of Elul in a regular year. So the title of today's podcast episode is Where Do Emotions Come From? And if you've been a good student of this podcast and you've been listening along daily, then you might say to yourself, hey, I know, because we actually spoke about this a couple of episodes ago where we were describing the different emotions that we feel as humans related to the animal soul, basically. And what we spoke about there is that really the origin of our emotions, the reason why we feel the way that we feel, actually originates in our minds. So that certain people who have different types of intellects, somebody with a more sophisticated, we could say, quote unquote, intellect is going to be drawn to more sophisticated, quote unquote, pleasures, we could say. Look at the difference between a child and an adult, and what do children like to do, what do children not like to do, versus what do adults like to do, what do adults not like to do. When we say children and adults, this doesn't necessarily have to mean in age. It can be in mindset as well. So we often see that, what would children rather do? They'd rather eat candy all day, stay up really late, just play, and all of that kind of stuff. And that is really because of the smallness of the mind, is the way that the Alter Rebbe described it, versus somebody who's a little bit more sophisticated in their mindset, who has a little bit of a more broader mindset, understands that eating candy all day might not be the best idea for them, and will appreciate the value of flossing, of brushing your teeth, of going to sleep early. These are the types of things that might actually bring them joy, is sticking to a routine, a schedule, a healthy regimen, and all of that kind of stuff, so that these things that the person actually enjoys doing is really based on their intellect. It's really based on their mind. When we really love somebody, why do we love somebody? Why do we feel this love towards somebody? It's because we know them. It's because we have this understanding, this appreciation of them. And often people that we're really close to, that we really love a lot, the more we get to know them, the more we come to understand them, the more our love for them grows. So this is true in the human realm. And what we started speaking about yesterday is we started translating this into the godly realm as well. That just like we have all of these emotions in our animal soul, and what we sometimes call the human soul, we also have these emotions parallel in the godly soul. And in fact, the godly soul is kind of the source, the archetype for all of the emotions in the world. So when we feel love towards certain people, towards certain foods, towards certain activities, or hatred towards different things, all of this is really stemming from the fact that really at the core, we all embody a godly soul. And this godly soul expresses all of these emotions, but really in relation to God. So our relationship with God can really be thought of as like the archetype for our relationship with everything else in the world, with every other person and every other thing in the world. We can always trace it back and look at the archetype of our relationship with God and see a parallel there. So yesterday we walked through this. We went through the different emotions of our godly soul, and we saw how this parallels in the godly soul. So we talked about the emotion of chesed, which is our first emotive attribute, and how this chesed, this loving kindness, this expansive kind of energy, when it comes to God, the way that this gets expressed is through giving, because this is the way that we express this godly energy, is in a giving way. When we do things, God likes when we give tzedakah, when we give to other people, and all of that kind of stuff. Then there's the emotional attribute of gvura. Gvura is the idea of restraint. That's when we hold back, when we develop a sense of self-control. and we hold ourselves back from doing anything that might be against God's will. So we went through all of the different emotions, and today we're going to really talk about how all of these emotions, just like in the animal soul or the human soul, they stem from the mind, from the three intellectual faculties. So too, when it comes to the godly emotions, these two stem from and can actually be nourished by our three godly intellectual attributes, namely, as you most probably know by now, these three attributes of Chokhmah, Bina, and Das. And as we'll see, that last one, the one of Das, is really the most important one. We spoke about the importance of Das a couple of episodes as well, where Das is really the glue that really connects the intellect to the emotions, because without Das, then they would really remain very separate. There wouldn't be that flow from the intellect to the emotions. So Das is what creates that flow. And so similarly here too, as we'll learn, when it comes to the godly emotions, there's a similar kind of flow that happens when we incorporate Das. Das is what allows the emotions to come to be birthed from Chokhmah and Bina, which are considered to be like the parents of the emotions, the mother and father of the emotions. And as we'll see today, we're going to actually bring up a new concept, which is the idea that Das actually has two levels to it, at least when we talk about Das in connection to God. There's lower Das, which is this aspect of the drawing down of Chokhmah and Bina into the emotions and connecting the Chokhmah and Bina into the emotions. But then we'll see that there's actually something called higher Das as well, Das Elyon. And that's what actually causes Chokhmah to connect with Bina. Because without this this connection point, this connector of Das to Chokhmah to Bina, then Chokhmah would just stay totally up there in its own realm. It would be like, several episodes ago, if you remember that episode where we spoke about the intellectual who can't speak or can't communicate effectively because they're really stuck in their head. They're really stuck in the realm of ideas. So without Das connecting Chokhmah to Bina, then Chokhmah would have no way. It would have no impetus to really become more fleshed out so that it can then become translated into emotions. So Das, translations are always very tricky, as I've mentioned many times. So Das is often translated to mean knowledge, but really I think a more appropriate translation for Das really has to do with connection, with attachment, which is why we see in the Torah that Das actually is synonymous with a marital union, with intimacy, because it really is about this joining of two things together. That's what Das really is. I mean, Das is a whole topic in itself. There's a lot more to say, but that's the basic idea about it that you need to know for today's episode. And so with that being said, let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. For context, we're in the middle of Epistle 15 of Iggeres HaKodesh, and we're going to be concluding Epistle 15 today. And so here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that, so just like when we spoke about the human attributes, the human emotions, we talked about how their source was in the intellect, within the intellectual faculties. So here too, there's a similar thing that the godly attributes they're rooted in the intellectual attributes. So how is this? How is it that the intellectual attributes are the root of these emotive attributes? Okay, so for example, so we have Chokhmah, right? So Chokhmah is the first intellectual attribute, again, translated as wisdom, really better understood as kind of like intuition. It's that space that precedes the intellectual understanding, the more like elucidated understanding. So in terms of God, because again, the divine soul is all about God. So it's the source of the part of the intellect that comes to understand God and understands God's wisdom and God's greatness and God's attributes, God's holy attributes that conduct and animate all of the worlds, the higher worlds and the lower worlds. So basically, the Chokhmah is this part of the divine soul that is like this intuitive space that comes right before a person actually sits down and meditates and thinks about God in a more logical, rational, and conscious kind of way. And then the Bina, that's the part that's where there's the actual meditation and contemplation upon God. on all kinds of different dimensions. So in Chassidus, they talk about this in terms of length, in terms of width, and in terms of depth. So this is there's a lot to explore there, but the basic idea is that when a person in their minds, they think about God in all of these different ways, in a long way, like in terms of what that briefly means is how to apply this knowledge in many different ways. The wide way is just like all the different aspects of the knowledge, and then in a deep way, meaning like really what is this knowledge essentially all about. So to be able to understand one thing for another, like to really be able to grasp things in a way that it's not like just the knowledge superficially, but you really know it and you can like make deductions out of it. So that's the idea of bina. And that not only that, but this true bina, that when a person has this level of bina on a true level, when the person truly understands something, what's the sign of true understanding? That this can lead to emotion. It's not going to just stay in the intellect. If a person's understands something, like sometimes when we've spoken about these intellectuals who are just like very, very high up there in their mind, and they seem to have a very deep grasp and understanding of things intellectually, but they're very cut off from their emotions, and it doesn't translate into their emotions. Like, let's say if you have somebody who is like an expert in nutrition and in health and things like that, you see this a lot of times with doctors who are often very obese, and they're sitting and they're lecturing their patients on good health and diabetes and high cholesterol and stuff like that. And they themselves, obviously, it didn't translate into their own self. So what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us here is that means there's something lacking in their understanding. True good understanding, the fullest utmost understanding will translate into feelings. It's not going to just stay in the mind. It's going to translate into feelings, specifically the feelings of love and fear, and all of the other emotions that here we're talking about, the emotions specifically of the godly soul. Because in this case, we're talking about the divine soul, the godly soul, coming to try to understand and think about and contemplate the greatness of God. And God's greatness is unfathomable. As the Alter Rebbe says, this is a citation from Tehillim, chapter 145, verse 3. His greatness is unfathomable. And now the Alter Rebbe kind of like walks us through how it is exactly that this meditation can lead to emotions of love and fear. Like, why does that happen? So the Alter Rebbe says that there's in an aspect of, let's say a person's taking the time to meditate and learn about God. So the aspect of learning about the greatness of God, the more the godly soul, the divine soul, meditates upon this, then a great fear and dread is going to come upon them. So it's kind of like the more you spend the time actually thinking and studying different things, it's going to translate. It's most likely going to translate into having some kind of emotional effect on you. So, I mean, that it would be hard to imagine that obese doctor sitting there. I mean, it would be one thing for him to be lecturing his clients about the art of eating well and all those things, and him kind of not following the same message. But like most likely, like it would be harder to imagine him sitting there eating a donut while he's actually sitting and thinking about and learning nutritional facts, right? I mean, it could happen, but it's not necessarily as likely. So here too, it's like a way that these emotions of fear and dread of going against God's will can be birthed is through taking the time to actually sit and think about God and the greatness of God. And this is what's known as being the lower aspect of fear. So fear has a lower aspect, and then fear has a higher aspect to it as well. And so this lower aspect of fear is the aspect of malchus. This also falls into the category of malchus, of sovereignty. This is like where you're scared of the king. You don't want to go against the will of the king. And then there is another part of the learning about the greatness of God that brings about this higher type of fear, which is, what's the higher fear? It's not fear of punishment necessarily and just like being scared, like, you know, in that like kind of simple way, but it's actually a bashfulness. It's like embarrassment. So it's a little bit more refined than that. And then there's another way of contemplating and meditating upon the greatness of God that can also bring about a great love for God, known as ava rabba, a very great love of God. And then there's another way a person can meditate upon God's greatness that can bring about a smaller love of God, the ava zuta it's called. And so too, so this is all about how like this meditation can bring about these different internal feelings of love and fear, which remember we talked about those are like the internal feelings. Then we have the external feelings, the external attributes, which is chesed, gvura, tiferet, all those, right? And these also come about through the intellect. They're sourced in the intellect. And with all of these, says the Alter Rebbe, there needs to be vested within them the aspect of das. So das is a very, very interesting thing. It's like that could be a lecture or many lectures in its own right, what das is all about. We've spoken about das previously quite a bit. It's the idea, often it's the third intellectual attribute. There's chokhmah, bina, and das. Dat in Hebrew, in like Israeli type of or Sephardi Hebrew, it's literally translated to mean knowledge or opinion, but it actually connotes a lot more than that. It's the idea of connection. It's the idea of attachment. It's when things become personal, when you would have that doctor in the room who's giving you knowledge and advice about nutrition, and he is keeping his own advice because he really feels it, and he's not just saying the words on an intellectual place. They're not just staying in his brain, but it actually does translate into his self. It is very personal. And so here the Alter Rebbe says this is the idea of where there's that connection of the soul that is to the understanding. So it's not just like a kind of cold understanding that a person understands something about the greatness of God, but it's actually going to connect to the soul. And from this is what's going to birth all these different emotions, so that there's going to be an emotional component to it as well in the divine soul. Because if a person even momentarily switches their minds, like shifts their attention to something else from this understanding that they're thinking about, then this emotion that they feel will also go away from being revealed, and it's going to become concealed once again. And it's going to be there in potential, but not in actuality. So like we've often had this experience in our lives, right? That like when you're focusing on your attention on one thing and you're feeling a certain way about that one thing, but then like something happens and something distracts you and your emotions follow that distraction as well. Right? So attention is a very, very powerful tool. We had a whole episode a while back where we talked about this experiment that was actually done on me at McGill University, where they showed us a film of these people throwing a basketball back and forth to each other. And there was a gorilla that walked right through, and most of the 800 students in the class, including me, did not notice the gorilla, or rather it was a man in a gorilla suit walking through. And that's because our attention was not placed on the gorilla. We were focusing on the ball going back and forth. So attention really does drive us. It drives where we are, not just intellectually, but emotionally as well. Those who saw the man in the gorilla suit, they were laughing. They were feeling a sense of humor that we were not feeling. We weren't feeling that emotion because we didn't see that, so das is this very essential thing that's all about connection. So now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he explains that this is why the act of intimacy, of sexual intimacy, is actually called das. So the most famous example of this is when we look in the Bible in the story of Bereshis with Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, where it says Adam yada et Chava, Adam knew Eve. This is a euphemism for explaining their physical intimacy that they had with one another. And so why is knowledge, das, associated with this act of physical intimacy? Because it's this idea of connection, this merging idea. And so now, interestingly, there are different levels of das. So there's something known as a lower das tachton, it's called. And this is das that becomes manifest, like extends into the emotive attributes and becomes vested within them to vivify them and to keep them in existence. So this is the das that basically, it's to explain this on a kind of Kabbalistic level, this is the das that comes, so you have like chokhmah, bina, das, and then that das afterwards, that connects to the emotions below, the chesed, gvura, tiferet, netzach, hod, yesod, and malchus. But then we have a higher das. There's a supernal das. What's that supernal das? This is the idea of the connection within the intellect itself, to be able to understand the depth of the intellect. And this is likened to a bolt of lightning that comes and like shines within a person's mind, so that it will come down below, so that this part of this depth of the understanding will come into comprehension with it in a wide way, and to be able to explain it with great length and in great width, which is the aspect of Bina, which is called the Rechovot HaNahar. This is called the expanses of the river, as will be explained in its place. So just to explain that, I kind of rushed through that a little bit. So the lower das is the das that connects the intellect with emotions below it, and the higher das is actually what connects Chokhmah with Bina. So that's where we have this intuitive sense of something that we can't quite grasp, but we know that it's true. We know that it's there, and we can't really put it into words. And then somehow we're able to translate it into words. We're able to come to this place of understanding. So it actually connects the Chokhmah with the Bina itself. There's actually an even higher form of Das Elyon, but we're not going to get into that today, where it actually connects the Chokhmah with this Koach HaMaskil, which is like even above that, the power to be able to, of the intellect in that way. But suffice it to say, the main point of all of this is just to really emphasize how important this Das trait is, this power of connection, of attachment, in terms of birthing all of these emotions that come about through intellect, and even to get the intellectual juices flowing, to get that stuff to happen by connecting the Chokhmah with the Bina. So that's the end of the section today. So now we have a really thorough map, hopefully, of all of our emotions, all of our intellectual faculties, both on a human level in terms of our rational or animal soul, and also on a more divine, higher level, and which is really ultimately the true emotions. So the next time, so maybe to translate this into practicality, the next time you have a feeling, you feel something, whatever that feeling is, take a moment and see if you can try to recognize what the feeling is. See if you can try to map it onto that topography of emotions that we talked about. And then see if you can think about how it might be serving as a metaphor for your service of God in some way. So the next time you walk into a room and you see a bunch of strangers, you've never seen them before. Let's say it's a party that you've been invited to and you don't really know anybody there, and you feel a sense of embarrassment or shame or fear in front of all these people. So first of all, recognize the fact that this is fear. This is the emotion of yira. And secondly, to recognize that this is just really here to teach you a lesson. This sense of fear is, you shouldn't be having fear of other people, of shame in front of other people, but it's really there to teach you that your deepest self has the sense of fear and shame before God. So that's what it's really truly all about, right? Maybe another thing that comes to mind is, let's say you have a craving for a certain type of food and you've had a long day at work and you just want to treat yourself. You just want to, give yourself a present, feed yourself in some way. So you eat a cookie. So that's coming from a place of chesed within you. You want to do good for yourself, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We want to treat ourselves sometimes. So maybe you could say a higher level of that would be treating somebody else well, acting nice to somebody else. Maybe not. Sometimes it's good to treat ourselves as well. Good if we need to nourish ourselves to be healthy. But you can also think about it in the sense that, wow, why do I have this desire to do good to myself or to others? And all of that is because ultimately my godly soul wants to do good. My godly soul wants to emulate God, who is all about doing goodness and kindness and chesed. So it can give you kind of like a little window into appreciating this deeper and more divine part of yourself. So that's it for today. And stay tuned tomorrow when we begin a new epistle, Epistle 16, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.